podcasts. And you might notice if you're joining us that we are not in a foyer.
We are not.
Between COVID and car troubles, we're off-site. I'm on-site. Dalen's
I am
joining me
off-site.
from off-site.
Yes.
And we'd like to do a sermon digest like we've been doing for the past several weeks. So, Micah chapter 2 was our text. I think we want to start with, what did we talk about?
Yes.
What
did we talk about, Ryan?
Micah chapter
What did
2.
you tell us?
What did I tell us? I think, so Micah chapter 2, we listened again. It was kind of like part 2 of God's judgment announcement against Israel and Judah's idolatry. And I tried to let us hear that, particularly from the question, or like the viewpoint of, what is it like to listen to people announce God's judgment to you? So we get this in the text. I've got it open on the side here. That's basically in verse 6. Micah's audience, you hear them echoing back to him, saying, "Don't preach at us. Like, stop that. Stop saying these things." And I was like, I know that feeling. I know the feeling of, please stop telling me that. Please get out of my face. So Micah's getting in the face of Israel and Judah. And I wanted to sink into like the weight that sometimes we feel and the projections that we put on God to say, like, you just have all of these unrealistic expectations about how I'm supposed to live my life. And then you threaten me with judgment, and I'm just done with this. I'm tired of it. And so I'm going to go find a different preacher. And I guess we could have gone, we'll talk about this later, but we could have gone there in talking about what does it look like to look for other preachers. But so what we did talk about was, well, wait a second, like, we don't want to hear this as the people of God. We don't want to hear God's judgment against wrongdoing and evil and idolatry, but is God right? And he is right. We kind of weighed that out. Does God really ask unreasonable things of his people in this call to a holy life? And not at all. Like, I don't think that you can really say there's anything unreasonable about God's demand that his people not take other people's stuff, not push people who are vulnerable into further vulnerability and danger, not betray their commitments to him as their God and to worship other deities. It's like there's nothing unreasonable about what he's asking. There's nothing impossible about what he's asking. And then I tried to just link all of that into our word holiness. Holiness is this word that has like these deep roots in Nazarene circles. And it feels like holiness becomes sort of the poster word for impossible standards that God expects us to live up to. And I just wanted to plug Micah 2 and the demands that God is making of his people into that definition to say, wait a second, this isn't impossible. I can't ever reach these standards. This is God asking us to love our neighbors as ourselves and not to take advantage of them. And that's the holiness that he requires. We're going to hear more about that in Micah 6, probably the most famous verses in Micah. What does the Lord require of you? But to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Anyway, that's sort of what we talked about. God's right to hold us to account. We don't like to hear it, but he doesn't actually ask terribly unreasonable things of us.
Right.
So that's sort of Micah 2. Yeah.
Cool.
Would you say, did that actually come through? Like, I think you got to listen to most or all of my sermon yesterday. Would you say that any of that landed? Like, that's my perception of what we said yesterday, but I never know actually what sort of listeners are walking away with.
I think it kind of landed. I think like, I think what the big thing that I remember from last week or last Sunday or yesterday was just like was just how like lightly you touched on more like contemporary things and like how it's still a word for us. And I was kind of like, oh, like I guess I would have preferred it. Like I would have liked it if you had been a bit more like came down a little bit on some of the other things and like said some things. But I mean, like you said, you're not really the one to say that because you don't really know all the things. But I was just, I think that's the main thing I thought of was just like, oh, okay, so how is this? I know how it's relevant for myself, but maybe somebody else, I don't know if they would have gotten that, but I don't know. That's just my my perception.
So
It was
it was
still good.
distracting. It was distracting that I touched so lightly on such a heavy
Yeah,
question.
I think so.
Particularly, one of the things that we didn't talk about that we could have was we could have talked a long time about what does it mean, what is this word about people taking advantage of one another, particularly when it comes to land rights. There's like chapter 2 talks about stealing property from other people and then profiting off of it
Yeah,
in a nation with colonial roots, where
yeah,
literally other nations came and displaced other people and now have established a government on lands that have displaced and continue to be a source of pain and oppression and abuse for other people. Particularly, so speaking of the First Nations truth and reconciliation work that's being done right now to say like what even is our history.
yeah.
So I didn't feel equipped to tackle that this week. And so I touched on that because it's like I think we can't hear this word without actually admitting that this word does touch our history in some way. I'm just not sure exactly how it does. And
Right.
so I wanted to ask the question and name it that way rather than say I have the answer to this question as well. I just wanted to ask it. And so I could see how that would be distracting because I know I'm distracted. Like I want an answer to that question and I'm not sure where to turn or what voices to listen to find a good and strong answer. So
Right.
working on it. But yeah, I could see how that would be very distracting from like, okay, you sort of teased me with this and now I'm thinking about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I think everything else was fine. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Well, I guess if that's what we talked about, you mentioned the what didn't we talk about more?
Right.
What were some things that we didn't really have as much time to get into?
There are some things that come up. One of them is a question I think that's actually rather relevant for Canada, and it might sound surprising, but like, is evil real? Feels like a question that our culture is genuinely asking to say like, is it possible that actually everything that we perceive as evil is actually it's just a hurt person lashing out of their own pain to hurt and that ends up hurting other people but really they're a victim of the trauma that's already happened to them and they're only acting that way because they've been mistreated and so like is evil really real like is it possible for a person to be evil and that could come up in this because you get it right off the bat in chapter 2 like alas for those who devise wickedness and evil deeds on their beds and it's like do people do that yeah
I I I love that because it just sounds like the most. Sorry.
go
It
ahead
just it sounds like such an edgy atheist 14-year-old thing to say. Like, oh yeah, but like is evil real? And it's like, you know what I mean?
yeah
And then like for
can
someone
you
to
really
then
say
like,
that this is wrong how could you say that
how could you say that? Technically Hitler did nothing wrong. And it's like, okay, dude, child. I don't know. I just it to me it just feels like a very um like something that people would argue about in a philosophy class,
yeah
but nobody would ever actually hold that like seriously.
like
Like they wouldn't
functionally
actually function in
base a
society.
nation or a law off of it yeah
No,
like
because you
is evil
can't.
real right
Because you can't do that because I don't know how else to say it, but evil is clearly real. Like I
you could say it like one of my profs said this is of all the things of all the theological realities that we have the most concrete evidence for the doctrine of original sin trumps everything there's
oh
so
yeah.
much concrete evidence for the doctrine that people are messed up and continue to mess up
Yeah.
other people like
I mean, like I just finished. So I had never read or watched The Hunger Games, but my wife just made me watch them all.
okay
And like, this is great. They're great movies. They're probably better books, but and it's just while I was watching it, I was like, wow, this is so messed up. But then I thought about it. So for those of you that don't know, The Hunger Games is basically a society. Like it's basically built on a society where there's basically these death games where like a bunch of people are sent to die, and like the capital, the people there, the capital, which is the ones that are not oppressed, they love it, and everyone's like, oh yeah, like, and you're like, that would never happen. But we glorify war, we glorify death. We actually had gladiatorial games. we do this. This is not hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays. I'm like, no, like we could definitely, I could see us getting to this point. Like it's so messed up. Like, I don't know. I don't know. I find it like I've never actually had someone come up to me and say that, but if they did, I'd probably just laugh in their face and just say like the Holocaust. Like, what is wrong with you? You
Right.
probably don't seem like a person I want to talk to because you're like convinced that evil doesn't exist, which just then makes me think that you're using that to
Justify some behavior that I
yeah, just
probably don't want to be around.
exactly. Like you just want to justify some really awkward, weird, evil things that you're doing. So
Right.
it's just,
So
know,
that's like one of the routes we could have taken is to say, are things actually wrong? And like what is actually wrong? And to say like if we want to hold a biblical worldview, then we can actually hold on to the idea that indeed evil is wrong. And there are things that are genuinely evil. God believes this. God holds us to account for our actions. So we could have gone there.
yeah.
I feel like the reason that you wouldn't like again like if there is none of us would none of the people that I know who I'm friends with would really come out and say evil's not really real.
No,
But
I
we
don't
might
think.
come out. We might come out with a thing that actually is based on that as a premise. It's like so it'd be like the iceberg underneath to say something like, "Well, God won't really judge me for that. Like it's not that
Uh,
wrong. Like maybe it's
yeah,
a little wrong, but it's not that wrong, right?" And
hierarchy of
try
sin. Yeah,
hierarchy of sin or any kind of like kind of justification to say like I'm not really hurting people. It's unfortunate that things went that way. And I could just see that all over the conversation through Micah too, to be like there if you have people who are profiting off of gaining other people's land, for them to say, well, I'm just doing really smart business. And so like we need
it's just
to
good to be.
it's just good business. Right. And if it hurts people, I mean like that's really too bad, but this is just how the world works, right? It's like it's not evil,
Yeah,
that's just how the world works, which is basically based on the premise of like, no, I'm denying that what I'm doing
yeah.
is evil. It's like so like you don't put it out front, but that's like in the back burner.
Yeah.
That's kind of
It's also
simmering that smell forward.
a lot of the people that say things like that, where it's like, they'll say something like, that's just the way the world works. Those are also the people that deny that there are systems of sin in the world. And usually, like where it's like someone could say, like, well, like systemic racism, it doesn't exist. Well, that's because you are like directly benefiting off of systemic racism.
Hmm.
Like you don't want it to exist
You know,
because if it exists, then you're screwed. It's like, you know what I mean? Like,
right, right.
or it's like systemic, I don't know, systemic whatever. Like it's like, no, systems don't exist. We don't, this doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But it does. And if the thing is that you don't want it to be that way. And that's why I find that a lot of the time when someone says like either they're not open to it or they don't want to talk about systems of sin. So like, by the way, when I'm talking about systems of sin, what I'm talking about is like a separation where it's like there's individual sin, like the bad things that I do, and then there's systems or communal sin, where it's like these are sins that are like they're so ingrained that they're part of our own culture. So greed, the fact that we think greed is good, that is a systemic sin. And so when I say systems of sin, that's what I'm
Right.
talking
So
about.
we might look at someone, say, in the buffet line,
Yeah,
and you see an individual act that you might call like, hey, you just sinned against everyone behind you because you just scooped all of the ginger beef onto that one plate and you just
yeah,
walked away like because you just wanted it all to yourself. And that's like an individual act of sin. But the
yeah,
fact that our most of our motivations when it comes to like working are built around the idea of accumulating wealth.
yeah,
That's actually made greed into a virtue. And you're
yeah,
just like, so I automatically think in those terms of like, what can I get for me? Like that's a systemic, like I'm being shaped to think in greedy ways.
yeah.
And
Well,
that
even
force
the fact
actually, yeah,
like the buffet itself, as it exists as itself, is a systemic sin in that we're like, oh yeah, it's totally normal to stuff yourself completely insane and be
right,
so over full that you can barely walk when there are people that are dying outside of hunger. Like
sure,
that is a systemic sin in that we think it's totally okay to get insanely full.
right,
That's what I like. Like that's kind of the idea.
yeah,
So like, no, you shouldn't. It's an individual sin to take all the ginger beef, but maybe it's also a systemic sin that we think it's okay to just get so full that it's like, yeah,
without thought for those who are,
other,
yeah, okay.
yeah.
So we could have talked about that. Is evil real?
Yes.
Um, on the note of like the particular like the hoarding of land and the property side of things, we could have talked about what inheritance means in Israel. And so I'm looking over at my screen here, and Micah 2:2, they covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They oppress householder and house, people and their inheritance. And it's like, okay, well, we could talk about how bad it is to like kick someone out of their house and steal it for yourself. That's bad on one level. And we
Yeah.
kind of did label that a little bit. What we didn't talk about is the significance of inheritance for the people of Israel. And so Micah's talking
Yeah.
to the people of Israel. And for them, when you have land holding in Israel, it's because God has brought you into this land and your family was actually allotted this section of the promised land. And so there's
Yeah.
actually their whole property system is based on returning inherited lands to the rightful family or
Yeah.
clan that or tribe that belongs to. And so like even if you, let's say you find yourself in a really hard spot, you're a farmer and you have to sell off some land so that you can pay some debts, that land is bound to return to your family by the
Yes.
systems, because it's like this is a reminder that like the way that we've organized our entire land is a reminder that Yahweh is the one who gives us this land. We don't own it independently.
Yeah.
And so for these smart business people to be collecting land that is the inheritance of their people is like undermining that system and saying, no, 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 this belongs to me now. It doesn't actually belong to God. And certainly doesn't belong to you who God has entrusted this to. It's like it undermines the whole system of worship
Yeah.
that Israel's entire society was built around. So
Yeah.
we could have talked more about that. Um,
Yeah.
there's
That's a whole sermon there.
probably more like a lecture series. To
Yeah.
be honest, like I can name that topic, and like there's not, I don't know what more you could say about it myself, like right off the top of my head. But it's like, well, that's a huge, that has so many implications and so much that you could explore there by looking into different texts all through the Old Testament to say, wow, that's a big deal for people to be stealing land from one another on an individual level and on this like macro level of you're undermining the whole point of the promised land and the whole point of God's relationship with his people through that.
Yeah.
I think just to like a teaser, one of the things that we could have talked about would be related to that would be if you scroll or flip down to sort of the end of the chapter, you get verse 10. It says, arise and go, for this is no place of rest, because of uncleanness that destroys with a grievous destruction. And uncleanness is that word that's like, how are we in our status of relationship to God? Like it's ritual purity. It's
Yeah.
like you have defiled the land that was made pure, it was sanctified, it was set apart for this people of God to show the world how to worship Yahweh. And so it's like, okay,
Yeah.
you're totally inverting and perverting the purposes of God by this greedy action. So we could have gone there in discussion of inheritance.
Yeah.
I think that you're most excited about this next one, in terms of like, what about false preachers and false gospels and the idea. So I
Yeah.
talked about, wow, it's really hard to listen to God bringing judgment on you and your people. It's like it's really hard for us to hear that. So we
Yeah.
turn to other preachers. It's like
Yeah.
you can kind of get fed up and say, I just want, can someone please tell me something nice or something good or something that I just agree with?
Something I find that one a really see the question that we usually ask later is what would you have preached on? I might have preached on this
Mm,
because I think it's one of the biggest problems that we have in Western evangelicalism as a whole is that we have a love affair with people who we agree with, but who aren't necessarily even Christian. Like they don't even call themselves Christian, but we just assume that they are. Two people come to mind with that. One of them is Ben Shapiro. I know a lot of people, young guys especially, who love Ben Shapiro. And they're usually Christian and they're like, yeah, he's such a good, like, because he's very conservative, very outspoken, very aggressive.
right.
He's an Orthodox Jew. He doesn't
Okay.
believe in Jesus Christ. It's an easy Google search. He is not a Christian at all. He doesn't love Jesus. He doesn't know God. The next big one is Jordan Peterson. Now, I have not like done research in the last little bit as to whether or not he's a Christian. The last time I checked, he wasn't.
Right.
He's never ever said he was a Christian. He has always he's always avoided the question, which is not what a Christian would do. But people, you hear so many Christians talk about Jordan Peterson as if he's like this incredible guy. And honestly, it's not even because he's incredible. He's just saying things that we agree with, or a
Right.
lot of people agree with. I don't like Jordan Peterson. I actually think that he says things that are counter to the gospel. But the problem is that we have this thing where we're like, we love these people, but they're not actually even Christian. They don't even live Christian lives. They just say things that we agree with. And so we think they're Christian. And so then when I come around and say, hey, you know what? Like, I think the biblical idea of, for example, manhood is to love your wife and take care of her and, to be there for her and, be a good person. And then Jordan Peterson says something, or Ben Shapiro says something along the lines of, no, the wife is supposed to serve the husband. It's like, well, a lot of people like that. So they go with that. And they say that that's biblical, but it's not actually biblical. Or what have you. I don't know if Jordan Peterson said that, but all I'm saying
I
is
would be surprised myself for what I've heard him talk about. But I hear what you're saying, which is to say, like, if you assume that someone's word is gospel or is coming from a gospel-centric value without even knowing, then it's like, okay, well, I just want to hear what I want to hear.
Or even people that are preachers. So, for instance, like people who are like explicitly say they're Christian, like Joel Osteen, for instance. Joel Osteen says very nice things. He says very nice, comforting things. And they're also false. Because like it's a lot of, yeah, God will give you money. God wants you to prosper. God wants you to have so much money. Also give me money. But like he's not a Christian. Like he's a Christian, but he doesn't actually he preaches you, tells you things you want to hear. Or there's like a lot of like older generation, maybe, where like certain preachers will just say like, I don't know. I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now. But like even or I don't know, somebody gets up and says the Conservative Party of Canada is the Christian party. I mean, very apropos. We are right on the same day as in a federal election.
Here we are.
And there might be a lot of preachers that are saying like, go vote for the Conservatives. That's the right way to go. But the only people that are going to listen to that are people that were already going to vote Conservative. And so they're just like, yes, this is the gospel message, as opposed to somebody who, like myself, isn't voting Conservative. And I'm like, okay, but is it? I don't think it is. And here's why. Let's have a dialogue about this. But if we just...
But I don't want a dialogue. I just want you to tell me what I want to hear.
And that's the thing. And that's what Mike is getting at, is people who don't want dialogue. They don't want discussion. They want simple, pat, easy answers. Faith is simple. It's easy. I can just believe what I want to believe, and I'll find some way, some person to tell me that I'm right. Instead of making up and thinking about it for yourself and reading your Bible and actually having reasons for things. Like, I don't mind having a discussion with I don't think it's much of a secret that I'm a fairly left-wing political person, but I don't mind having discussions with a right-wing person at all, as long as they're willing to have a dialogue and have a nice discussion.
Right.
If you're willing to talk to me about things and you're willing to say like, hey, this is what I think. What do you think about this? Interesting. This is my view. Like, just have a nice discussion. But if you're going to start yelling at me, no. If you're not even going to think about what I'm having to say, no. And that's what Mike is saying, is that these people, he's trying to tell them like, hey, this is a problem. And all the people are doing in return is, shut up.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear it.
Don't want to hear it.
I don't want to hear it. Don't tell me. Don't say that. That's wrong. Because I have somebody else telling me that I'm right, and I think they're right, and I don't want to think about it, so they're right. And I think that's a big thing that Mike is getting at, and it's a really big problem in our culture right now, especially Western Christianity.
I think, especially as you mentioned that, I think this is maybe a scary button to push, but the thing that's maybe dangerous about our refusal to dialogue is that politicians know that people don't really want to hear, don't want to critically engage these things, especially on certain issues.
Oh yeah.
And so if you choose a hot button issue like abortion, and you platform around that.
Yep.
Not based on values, but based on I can gain votes as long as I have this in my platform. And that's all I need to do. That's all I need to say is that one or the other. I'm
Yeah.
pro-life, I'm pro-choice.
Well,
And
that's what
that means that I will gain all of these people who care about that issue more than anything else.
well, that's what the People's Party's doing. All they're doing is saying we don't want to do anything about vaccines, and suddenly everyone that doesn't like vaccines is just going to vote for them.
Right.
Even though, like, Maxime Bernier probably got the vaccine. Seriously, he probably did. I don't like. He probably did. But it's like, but that's what Donald Trump did in the U.S.
Right.
He doesn't actually hold half the things. He just says things, and then people are like, yeah. Instead of thinking through and going like, oh, okay, is this actually the issue we need to do? It's like
Yeah.
and I think it is a hot button issue. I think it is a button to push, but I think it's something that we should do as ministers of God's word, where we are supposed to talk about this, where it's like, yeah, like I like if it's why the Conservative Party will almost always have at least a Christian leader or a leader who is willing to say they're Christian, because there are people out there who are Christian and they will simply vote for the Conservative Party simply because the leader's a Christian, and that's it. That's their only reason.
Because they're willing to be identified as a Christian.
Yeah, and that's it. You know? Even if they don't actually live a Christian life, it doesn't matter. All it matters is that they're willing to be identified that way. I will vote for them. It's like, okay, but their policies suck. Like, right. or maybe they don't. All I'm saying is that it's confirmation bias, I think, is what Micah is kind of digging at.
Right.
So,
or even what you might say, like the God reminds us that people will try to manipulate you, and if you can remember what's true. And I don't know if the takeaway is like you need to think about this more, as much as it's going to be a necessary skill for us to hear people get in our face if we want to hear the word of the Lord. And I think that theologically speaking, back to sort of this total depravity idea or original sin, it's like if we already know that in us, and this is just coming out of John chapter 3, in us is like this dark tendency that's like, I don't really want to be confronted. Then when the light of truth comes and shines on your darkness, you need to know that that's going to be a confronting experience where you're going to have to decide whether you're going to hide from the light or if you're going to say, yeah, you're right, you got me.
Yeah. And I think one of the ways, so maybe our listeners are like, okay, that's great. What do I do about that? How do I learn how to deal with this? The way I probably would have, again, I'm kind of merging two of our talking points because I probably would have preached on this, but I think one of the ways to do it is to read. Well, I always just think the best way to do something is to read a book. But read and listen to, however you want to, people you disagree with. And try and do it without getting ragingly angry. And try and think about where they're coming from and try and understand their points. And you can disagree with them. You can strongly disagree with them. But be able to dialogue and understand that they actually may have a good critique of you. Like on my bookshelf, I've got a wide variety of people that I read and that I dialogue with. Like I get this a lot. I like John Calvin's Institutes, but there's a lot of people that are like, you're a Calvinist then. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I just like to read him. Like, it doesn't mean I like everything he has to say. It just means, but that's a very hard thing in our culture because we just want people that we agree with.
Right.
So if we just live in this echo chamber, why would you have somebody in your echo chamber that doesn't agree with you? Because that messes everything up. So I think the best thing to do is listen to. So if you have a really big problem with the NDP, listen to Jagmeet Singh. Listen to that. Actually, like you have a problem with critical race theory, you don't like it, read books on it, written by people that agree with it, so that you actually understand their points and not point like. So the problem is that we'll do like, for instance, like you're like, oh, I don't understand critical race theory, I don't like it. I'll go to the people that I know don't like it, and they'll tell me why I shouldn't like it.
Right.
So if I don't like let's say I don't like the idea of complementarianism. I'll read a complementarian argument and be like, okay, that's what they have to say. Why do I disagree? And so that learning to think, it's called critical thinking.
Right. It sounds to me like the other image you might have is to say, if you disagree with a preacher, and maybe you disagree over a course of time, to say like maybe you don't get up and leave the first Sunday. To say like,
yeah,
you're going to preach on that, I'm out.
yeah.
And maybe
No,
even just say maybe stay and ask.
Yeah.
If you can, like I recognize that there are probably all kinds of preachers who you might listen to who you'll never get to go for lunch with them.
Yeah.
Maybe
And
like either
they're
based on their schedule or based on their disposition, even maybe they won't listen to you. But do
yeah.
you stay long enough to say, okay, I know what you're saying, and then to weigh it? Is this good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to go like, okay, is it possible to have dialogue at least with people in the church? Is this a community that I think will accept me and love me, and I can be a part of this community and that sort of thing, as opposed to, oh, the preacher one time said that he doesn't, I don't know, he doesn't
Vote
like one thing.
conservative.
He like, yeah, like maybe the
Doesn't vote
pastor
conservative.
says
Whoa.
votes or doesn't vote conservative. I mean, any preacher who speaks about politics from the pulpit as like a you should go vote for this party, I'm probably going to leave, because I'm like, oh, I don't like you. But like, I'd be like, well, why are you, maybe I would leave, or maybe I'd be like, at least have a conversation, be like, hey, why did you think it was okay to talk about politics from the pulpit like that?
Yeah.
Like,
That
there
would
are
be the
certain
thing. That would be the case in point for yourself to say like
yeah,
that would be the red flag where it's like I would
yeah,
be so tempted to leave. Maybe the thing to do is to say, how is that okay? Like,
yeah. Go up to
what
the
is
preacher
happening
after
here?
and just be like, hey, why did you think it was okay for you to just plug a political party from the pulpit? And then they say their piece, and if I'm like, I strongly disagree, or we have a conversation, then I'm like,
Then yeah,
okay, well,
gauge how much of a conversation can happen here.
yeah. And then if they're willing to have a conversation and talk about it, sure, maybe stay or leave. It's up to you. But at least be willing to engage,
Right.
instead of just running away when somebody says something you don't like.
Do not preach, thus they preach. Do not preach of such things, is Micah's word. It was like, yeah, get out of here. You can't preach the judgment of God against us. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a fairly long detour down that one. Notice I think it's a good one, but I'm wondering if we should leave it at that and invite any questions or comments from others. Was there anything else that you wanted to hear from me about this week's sermon, or?
I don't think so. I think I'm pretty good with that, at least. But why? Oh, maybe if you have time, quickly. Why did you focus on what we focused on?
So I think there's a couple ways to answer that. One of those ways is kind of as a learning preacher, I'm trying to learn how to connect with people. And I really felt like on the sermon before last week, so our Micah 1 sermon, I did very little to really kind of connect to a sense of, I know what that's like, I've experienced that, and very much was just in a sort of lecture mode. And so I very much wanted to take a window of shared experience to say, I think I'd love to be able to sort of sink into Micah from a sense of, I'm getting what he's getting at, or I'm getting what he feels like. So the shape of the sermon was very much, I was trying to build as much sense of we're hearing this. I know what it's like to sit under holiness preaching, or under someone who's getting in my face, or under the weight of all of these impossible standards. And I thought that would be a helpful way for us to sort of hear this word, partially because it helped us to set it up to be like, oh, this impossible holiness preaching, I never feel like I'm good enough. That's a great posture then to receive, like, did you know that the grace of God isn't about you being good enough? That's really cool, that God accepts us in our sin. He does not always treat us as our transgressions deserve. But Psalm 103, that he's a forgiving God. And it's cool to be able to set that up. It's also cool that it's like from that impossible standards standpoint, we got to ask, are these impossible standards? Like, what is the holiness that God calls us to? And so, like, just speaking sort of tactically, I was trying very much not to lean so hard into the experience of like, what is it like to hear this text, that we didn't actually hear the text. And so I thought this window gave us the best chance to really hear Micah, for where we are, as far as I can tell, as a congregation. And so didn't go into like, is evil real? Because it's like, well, that's going to be a philosophy class conversation. Not, at least right now, it didn't feel like it was the sermon for today. Inheritance and inheritance theology was like, I mean, that's probably going to be the sermon that you could follow up with to say, like, what does land mean to God? What does land ownership and colonialism mean? As we're asking, what does it mean for us to be Christian in Canada? That's going to be part of the ongoing conversation. But I wasn't ready to go there, so we didn't. In terms of false preachers and false gospels, there's a part of me that thinks there's more of that kind of coming in Micah. There'll be more opportunities. And there's another part of me that's really hesitant to sort of hop on a hobby horse, where I think I'm going to start pointing fingers at particular people or trends and say, like, wrong, and I'm right. And so I didn't see Micah calling out particular labels except for sort of the general, you're oppressing my people, God's judgment is coming upon you. So I wanted that, especially that just sort of overarching message to land more than I wanted any of those other sort of like side conversations to be the main point. And I thought that by asking the holiness question, we could hit something like, man, does God have unrealistic expectations for us?
Right.
Does it matter that I live my life in a just way? Is that living in a just way sort of like related to this judgment of God? Does God? And so I just felt like it was the best way for us to hear the text. So yeah, I don't know. Does that hold water as you're hearing it?
I think so. Like I get what you're saying. I think one of the things that I would like maybe push on or like nuance a little is just like, I think what Micah was doing there is he was saying something, but he was speaking on like a trend. He was speaking on like a very modern thing for him. He was like, this is something happening in my culture.
Yeah.
I'm going to poke on that. And so like perhaps from the pulpit, I may not have said specifically like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, whoever, well, Joel Osteen. I may not have like actually pushed the names, but I would have said, we have a tendency to do this. And I see this happening with this. Now, what I probably would have done is I would not have said who I was voting for from the pulpit. I would never say that because I don't think that's appropriate. I would never have said, like, if I used the Conservative Party as an example, I would have used the Liberal Party as an example in the next one.
Right.
Like as the second example. I would always pair them together.
Yeah.
Because I think there's people that do both for sure. Or I would have just said your favorite political party.
Right.
Or something like that. I would have made it nonpartisan because, so in this space, I am being partisan because I'm a human being and I have political views. But from the pulpit, I'm not going to do that as much because I don't think it's appropriate. That's not my place. Right. So I probably would have, but I would have poked on our intense desire to want to stay in an echo chamber. I may have pressed on like the echo chamber of social media. I may have pressed on the echo...
just mute people that you disagree with. They don't show up in your feed anymore.
Yeah, I think I may have pushed on that. I think there is, so I never want to tell people how to live from the pulpit, but I don't mind like saying, hey, this is an issue. How do you want to deal with that? Do you want to say that you disagree with me on the issue, which is fine? Or do you want to maybe, you're like, oh, you know what, it is an issue. Oh, maybe I should, how does that work in my life? I think I'll come a little bit closer to the application side than maybe you would, but I think that's just stylistic difference, perhaps. I don't know. Not sure.
Maybe.
I'm still a very junior preacher.
There's stylistic difference, maybe, but there's also probably personal conviction and difference within that to say like you have a different perspective that enables you to sort of hold convictions where it's like I might not share that conviction. Not that it's wrong, but that it's like I actually just I don't feel the urgency of it the same way that you might. So experiences shape us and how we present our own thoughts. So yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Well, This has not been in the foyer. It's been in a couple of offices, but this has been in the foyer, and it's been great to share this conversation with you. Thanks so much, Dalen.
Yes, thank you.
We'll see the rest of you next time.
Yes. All right.